The International Studies Professor at Yat-Sen University, Professor Shaher Al Shaher, who's joining us now. Thank you for being with us here on Qnews. So what would you say are the motivations behind the US-brokered ceasefire? And how does it align with the interests of the parties involved, like Israel or Turkey or Jordan?
Of course, good afternoon, greetings to you all. In fact, we can see an overview of the situation. It's not just a fight between the tribes and the Druze in the region. It's a scheme to occupy part of the Syrian territory, which is the Israeli aspiration that is going to link it to the Euphrates River. This scheme failed. It was the direct reason for all the conflict that happened in the region. There was an intervention by the tribes forces in Syria, and there was a warning from a neighboring Arab countries, especially from Jordan, Iraq, and Lebanon, and even Saudi Arabia, and that's why everyone felt threatened and felt that the threat might actually transfer to the entire region. There was an Israeli flagrant intervention, and there was a pledge from the United States to preserve the sovereignty of the Syrian territory and support for the new Syrian leadership. As well, there was a regional support carried out by Turkey and the GCC countries for the new leadership in Syria. All of this resulted in pressuring Israel to stop the hostilities. But the problem now lies in allowing the Syrian troops to be redeployed in the region decisively to settle the dispute between the tribes and the troops and the Druze in the region.
Well, given that we have reports of that some clashes have resumed despite the truce, how effective or enforceable is the ceasefire in practice?
I think that this deal is somehow fragile because it has to be done by consensus, and the both parties desire to have a real settlement to the dispute, and also the ability of the Syrian forces to be redeployed in the region. The agreement said that the public security can be redeployed, but there are concerns or reserves by those to have the security forces again. The tribes are still fighting, and the calls persist by the state for the tribes to stop the fight. So far, the tribes are being exposed to assaults during their exit. This is where things are going, and I think that the Syrian forces and the public security might not be able or have the capacity, and the Syrian army might have to intervene after all.
Do you think that Israel's justification that they're protecting Druze populations, it might be masking a broader military objective in southern Syria?
Of course, the Israeli excuse to use the Druze card is completely rejected, and no one can actually believe that. Even the Druze themselves refuse such allegations, and they do not want the Israeli protection. But there is a faction, one faction of the Druze that called on Israel to intervene, and that's why I think the main problem. What Israel doing is known to everyone. Even Israel stating this publicly. They want a new Middle East region, and they want this Suwaida to be the new gateway for this new Middle East. There has been messages said to be peaceful messages with the U.S. envoy to Syria. He talked about the outdated Sykes-Picot maps, and the borders must be again, and that's why Israel is trying to impose a new de facto, a new Sykes-Picot borders.
And we have the involvement of the southern Syrian Tribes Assembly. Is that reshaping the political landscape in Suwaida? What leverage do they hold?
Any calls for a truce comes in the right direction, but we also should be reminded that no one has the upper hand in this situation. There is no discipline from both sides, from both fighting sides, because they are not systematic armies. So we don't expect a prompt response, in spite that the tribes' forces announced that they will not intervene. Also, the Syrian government initiated to cut all the roads leading to Suwaida, because there were a lot of forces from the tribes coming from southern Syria to reach Suwaida, and this maybe alleviated the situation, and containing the situation inside the city, I think, requires some time.
And of course, there's a 48-hour Israeli-approved deployment of Syrian forces into Suwaida. What does this mean for future sovereignty and regional military norms going forward?
I think it's been a while since the Syrian forces was there in the Suwaida city. Even before the Israeli intervention, the Syrian forces were not allowed to enter the city, and they were assaulted more than once. The governor was assaulted and dismissed out of his office. The government must respect the privacy of the city, but when the conflict moved to the Druze and the tribes, the government had to intervene. So far, the factions in Suwaida is rejecting the government intervention in the city, and they only want Damascus to bear the brunt of this conflict.
And there are reports of mass casualties and abuses too in Suwaida. How credible are these claims?
We see photos on social media of violations committed by all parties. These are very insulting and offensive violations, completely bare of any humanity. And the pledge of the Syrian president came to have fact-finding missions to hold the perpetrators accountable. Of course, there are violations, certainly, but the state role stands to hold everyone accountable, and who wants to actually do that should start with themselves and present their own perpetrators first to be prosecuted.
Well, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on Qnews. Professor Shaher Al Shaher from Damascus, the International Studies Professor at Yat-Sen University. Thank you very much.